Hello learner, I believe you've been doing well and we've got another opportunity to interact in the manifested e-learning platform. We continue with our discussion on communication where we are discussing the topic nature of communication. We will continue with that discussion and today we would be looking at types of communication and then we will proceed to the organizational communication networks. However, it is important that you note our discussion shifts to one specific level of communication, which is the concern of these units. Remember, we discussed different levels of communication, where we had the intrapersonal level, interpersonal communication, transpersonal, formal, or what we called organizational communication, group communication, and mass communication. Our discussion is now going to focus on the formal communication that takes place within a formal establishment, better known as the organizational level communication. Basically, an organization operates using the communication process. It is the tool that the organization uses to maintain relations, both internally and externally. It is therefore important to know that there are two broad types of communication in an organization, which are internal communication and external communication. We're identifying two broad levels. There are two broad, or not levels but types, broad levels of communication, which are internal communication and external communication. Internal communication, which is the first level. From the word internal, this tells you that this is communication that takes place within the organization. In order for the organization to get things done, to ensure that organizational activities are being undertaken, inevitably individuals and departments as well as sections must consistently be involved in the communication activity, so that this is communication between individual employees, communication between managers, communication between departments and units, What is this communication used for? Or what is the purpose of internal communication? This communication is going to be used for different purposes. It is the communication that is going to be used for group decision making, so that organizations need to make decisions on a number of things. It is also going to be used for a group problem solving. It's also going to be used for conflicts resolution. Conflicts will exist between individual employees as well as departments and sections. The kind of communication is going to be used to provide information. People need information to be productive. It is also going to be used for purposes of explaining the organization vision, mission, goals, and objectives, as well as policies, rules, and procedures. The kind of communication is also going to be used to give orders and advice, or in short, in directing organizational processes, including supervision. The kind of communication is going to be used to provide feedback on issues, provide feedback. It is also going to be used for control and coordination of organizational activities, coordination of activities. It's also going to be used to give advice, for counseling, etc. So that internal communication serves many purposes. The other type of communication is external communication. External communication. And this is communication between the organization and the outside world. The outside world. It is important to remember that an organization does not exist for itself. It exists to serve others, better known as stakeholders. So that for an organization to survive, it needs to reach out, to persuade and convince customers to purchase the products, so that communication will be directed to customers through the publicity mechanisms. An organization needs suppliers. It must maintain relationships with suppliers through the communication process. An organization has dealings with the government through government agencies and bodies. Compliance are policies of the organization and the rules and bureaucratic regulations of the land. All businesses are expected to conduct business within a particular bureaucratic framework. An organization exists in the society. It must maintain good relations with the society. So this example is communication between the organization and the customers, suppliers, government, financiers, etc. What is the kind of communication used for? Again, this one is also going to have many uses in an organization. One is for persuasion, e.g., the need to persuade customers to buy products. Public relations by building goodwill. It is also going to be used for purposes of networking. An organization needs to establish networks with the larger society, with the larger community. It is also going to be used for collecting and gathering data, such as during market research, for collecting data, e.g. during market research. You need to talk to different stakeholders. It is going to be used for compliance purposes, and meeting the regulatory requirements. It's also going to be used for purposes of building business partnerships, It is also going to be used for purposes of attracting investors, among other uses. Attracting investors. So both forms or types of communication will facilitate execution of organizational operations and activities, which is the oil that runs the business. Without this kind of interaction, both internally and externally, then an organization will be at a standstill. Now, we'll take this discussion further to now consider the networks through which communication in an organization, or what is better known as organizational communication, is effected, so that communication is channeled through different networks in an organization. So our next discussion is on organizational communication networks. Organizational communication networks or systems. Or systems. We will define a communication network as refers to the set of channels through which communication is effected, in an organization. It is important to note that these channels are linked to each other. These channels are linked to each other in a supplementary manner. They work together. No channel works in isolation. They all must support each other so that communication is effectively executed in an organization. We will identify the two main communication networks, so that there are two main communication networks in an organization. Main communication networks in an organization, which we will identify as the first one, formal channel or network, and the second network is the informal network, better known as grapevine. Network. So if communication is not taking place through the formal network in an organization, then it takes place through the informal network. We start off our discussion with the formal network. From the word formal, this simply means that these are the official channels of communication in an organization. The organization develops a system of communication which is the acceptable way or approach to effecting communication in an organization. And this channel is what is going to be described as the formal channel. It is the official channel of communication or channels of communication in an organization. It refers to the officially designated or prescribed ways of communication in an organization. For that reason, this kind of a network is deliberately developed. It is deliberately developed by the management. And where is this channel prescribed? Or how are the official means of communication prescribed? The official channels of communication are going to be prescribed in organizational charts, so that the organizational chart defines the official way of communication. Organizational charts, organizational communication manuals, or it's developed through practice, developed through custom or practice, so that as employees continue to interrelate, the formal channel is officially formed. Now, we can further subclassify the formal network in many ways, so that if we can consider the classification of formal network communication, is that it can be classified further based on flow or direction of the communication, so that we will have one vertical communication, which is further split into downwards and upwards communication. And the other flow is lateral communication, which can further be split into horizontal and diagonal communication. If I can use a diagram to represent the classification of formal communication using a simple organization chart. A simple organization chart shows, among other things, positions and different activities or roles in an organization, so that we can have a person at the top of the organization who was the MD. Then we have departments, different departments. We have like finance department. We have a department like marketing. we have a department like operations, headed by managers. Under each of these departments again, there are sections. We can have marketing, not marketing but promotion, also known as marketing by default. We can have distribution. We can have employees right under here. So clerks, we just have clerks, etc. Now, when we talk of formal communication being classified based on direction or flow, in this chart, communication is either going to be effected in this direction from the bosses to the juniors, or it can as well be effected from the juniors to the bosses, or it can be effected through, that is, this direction. So that these lines, other than representing the lines of authority and responsibility, they also represent the lines of communication. So two main features of the chart, features of this chart, two important ones are one, that is a hierarchy of authority or flow of authority and responsibility. Authority and responsibility. What that means is it shows the superior subordinate relationships. And it also shows the lines of communication. Effectively, any communication effected in this direction, it is going to be described as vertical communication. And you realize that vertical communication again will flow in two directions. It's either flowing from the top to the bottom or from the bottom to the top. In which case, this kind of a flow is going to be known as upward vertical communication, and this other flow is going to be known as downward vertical communication. If communication takes place in this direction vertically, then not vertically but horizontally, it is going to be known as lateral or horizontal communication. Communication again can take this direction in an organization, in which case it's going to be known as diagonal communication. We will proceed to discuss these different flows or communication directions, and we will start with vertical communication. This is under the formal network. So under the formal network, we are identifying two directions in which communication is effected, which is the vertical direction, better known as vertical communication, and the horizontal direction, better known as lateral or horizontal communication. So vertical communication or network, it's either the network or communication, vertical communication network. From this diagram, You can easily describe vertical communication as communication or flow of messages are through different levels of authority and responsibility. Levels of authority and responsibility. What that means is that the parties in the communication will have different status and authority differences, i.e., different status and authority. Communication taking place between people of different status and authority in the organization. We are splitting down vertical communication into two, so that there is one that flows from this side to downwards, and down here upwards. So that under vertical communication we have downward vertical communication, downward communication, again, which you can easily describe from the diagram, that downward communication is the flow of messages or exchange of messages between superiors and juniors, i.e., communication from a higher level of authority, and responsibility to a lower level, We are calling it manager-subordinate communication. Manager-subordinate communication. Now, what would be the objectives of downward communication? For what reasons will managers be addressing the juniors? Objectives of downward communication. This communication has many uses, and generally it is used by managers to convey information relating to the employees' work issues and to facilitate organizational activities to be executed effectively. So it is important to note that this kind of communication is required or seeks to provide information required by employees to perform their job and meet the expectations of their bosses. And that will be achieved by or through the following uses, so that it's used for: 1. Communicating the organization vision, mission, and goals. Bosses will also use that information to explain organizational policies, procedures, rules and work methods. The communication again is also going to be used by bosses for purposes of controlling and coordinating. Controlling and coordinating activities. Managers must know the respective areas under them, how they are progressing with work. In addition, this kind of communication is also used to provide general information to employees, information that they need to get work done, to provide information to employees. It is also used by bosses to advise and counsel workers. Employees will be in situations of conflicts. It's also going to be used for conflict resolution. The kind of communication again is also going to be used for supervision. Instructing employees on what to do. So it's used for giving orders and instructions, among others. Now, while effective downward communication is beneficial to the organization, this kind of a communication faces a number of challenges that makes or compromises the quality of the communication. It is common for subordinates or employees to complain on the quality of communication that they are receiving from their bosses, leading to a lot of apathy and opposition from juniors. And this arises as a result of a number of challenges that this kind of communication faces. And that brings us to the discussion of the limitations or problems, limitations or problems of downward communication, problems of downward communication. This communication, as I said, faces a number of challenges. The first challenge is authority or status and authority differences. Status or authority differences. Authority differences. The result of this is that bosses may want to bossy their juniors because they are superior. So a tendency by bosses to violate communication rules, communication principles and rules, so that bosses will issue personal orders, will disrespect the juniors by not following the protocol of communication, which compromises the effectiveness of this communication. Another challenge that faces this communication is distortion. Well, because of the long chain of communication, the long hierarchy, when communication originates from the top office, directed to the employees, it means that that communication must go through all the levels before it reaches the intended audience. During that process, as this communication or message is processed at every level, it changes its meaning. It loses its meaning because at every level, the people processing the information may add or remove some of the details of the message, whether knowingly or unknowingly. So distortion, chances of message being altered due to the communication chain, or due to processing at different levels. Another challenge with the downward communication is speed. It is very slow. Speeds. When a message originates from the top before it gets to the person it was intended at the bottom, it will take a considerable amount of time. It is slow due to the need for processing at each level. Another challenge with this communication is that it is authoritarian, and that challenge will be better known as built-in resistance. The fact that it commands too much authoritarianism and does not give room for employees' views, which makes them detest it, which makes them develop apathy and resistance to the communication. This is the situation where employees will always question orders from their bosses, will always question the suitability and utility of policies developed by the bosses. The fact that they don't feel involved in the process, then they become antagonistic towards this kind of communication, which can very easily affect the effectiveness of that kind of communication. The next type of communication under the vertical, please note that we are discussing the vertical communication network, which is split into two depending on the direction, so that it is either flowing from the top to bottom, which we call downward communication, and the other direction is from the juniors to the superiors, which we called upward vertical communication. So we will now proceed to consider the upward communication. So still under vertical communication, our second flow is upward vertical communication. From that diagram again, hope you still have it in mind. This is a communication from lower levels of authority, to higher levels, which can be looked at differently as communication from juniors, which we call subordinates, to superiors. Now, this is a kind of communication that originates with the employees and is directed towards their bosses. Now, for what reasons or purposes will juniors be addressing their bosses? Purposes or objectives of upward communication. Now, again, this one will be used for a number of uses. The first one is providing feedback. Providing feedback, of course, on how things are doing, on how work is progressing, and yes, on how work is progressing literally, and the understanding of the juniors or employees of the policies of the organization. Again, it is also used as a forum for constructive suggestions. Constructive suggestions, so that employees use this avenue to give their views, ideas and opinions on organizational processes. By virtue of the fact that employees are involved in the real work, they might have good ideas that may improve organizational performance. So this channel or flow of communication affords them the opportunity to express themselves on issues. Again, this kind of communication is also used for whistleblowing, where employees use it to report, for reporting malpractices are taking place in the organization, to higher authorities taking place in the organization. Again, it is also used as an outlet for pent-up emotions, Employees will have grievances for airing grievances and problems affecting employees. Similarly, this kind of communication is also used to create harmony, creation of harmony and cohesion. It provides an opportunity for employees to interact with their bosses, for interaction and improving relations with superiors or bosses. And finally, this kind of communication is also used to facilitate change. Facilitation of change gives employees a chance to take part in change processes. As a result, by involving employees in change processes, they are likely going to be less antagonistic. They are likely going to take change positively and are not try to resist change which may be introduced by the management. The same way, the upward or downward communication suffers from challenges. Upward communication also faces its own problems, so that its effectiveness is also compromised by such limitations or challenges. It is not uncommon for there to be a communication breakdown between juniors and their bosses. And it is because of these challenges or limitations that these failures arise. So limitations of upward communication. Now, upward communication is going to face, among others, the following challenges. One is status differences or authority differences, a barrier or challenge shared across the two communication flows, differences, lack of information, lack of communication, reluctance to communicate, lack of feedback from bosses, Another barrier facing this kind of communication is protection and distortion. And the last challenge is fear of victimization. Now, the fact that superiors or bosses sit in a superior position, employees are never free to engage their superiors effectively. This may make juniors hold back on trying to engage their superiors because of that difference in authority and status. I would correct, this is not lack of communication, but it's lack of information. Lack of information as a challenge. What this means is that sometimes juniors lack adequate information, for the simple reason that some managers have a tendency to withhold much of the information to make sure that the juniors are heavily dependent on them. Some managers only feel that the only way to be recognized that they are superiors is by making employees so dependent on them, by withholding all the information. So when employees don't have the information, they will equally have nothing to communicate. Reluctance to communicate is as a result of employees feeling that it is the duty of the management to initiate communication. And for that reason, juniors will always wait for communication to come from the bosses, but not the other way around. Lack of feedback is on issues that employees keep on raising. If those issues are never addressed or they are ignored, this discourages any further communication from the juniors to the subordinates in future. The employees would just be discouraged. They will say, after all, we'd rather live with our problems or keep our problems because even if we raise them, nobody is going to be concerned about addressing them. Protection and distortion. This arises when employees have issues against their bosses. Maybe a feeling that a boss style is not one of the best styles to manage the activities of the juniors. Or employees feel that their boss is incompetent and is affecting all of them in their ability to reach targets and expectations. Now, the juniors can only get recourse from the top, but formal communication requires that the communication must follow the channels of communication. So if you are going to report your boss to their boss, that communication must go through the same lines of authority. In the event such issues arise, you address an issue to your boss so that they can pass it. This boss will not agree to pass the message in its adversarial form. They will try to improve it, change it for it to suit the manager in question here. Eventually, the kind of messages that will reach the intended source will be completely distorted for that matter. Fear of victimization is that juniors do not always trust their bosses so that they can raise sensitive issues against them. Hence, they are afraid to raise issues touching on their bosses because they might face repercussions or might be victimized for such kind of a conduct. And then this makes sure that employees keep information and sensitive information to themselves for that kind of fear. So this effectively covers the first organizational communication network, which is the vertical communication network. We will end this lesson on that note, and in our next lesson we'll continue with our discussion on communication networks. You may have a nice time.
Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to get yourself a copy of our professionally prepared study text and revision partners. Visit our shop along Tom Boyer Street, Pioneer House, 3rd floor, opposite Fire Station.